The bullet entered between her shoulder blades at 2:47 in the morning. Ivy Harris felt her legs give out, felt the cold mud rise to meet her face, felt the warmth of her own blood spreading across her back. Above her, gunfire tore through the darkness like thunder. Bodies fell around her, some already silent, others crying out in languages she didn't understand. She tried to move, tried to breathe, but her body wouldn't respond. This was it. 23 years old, bleeding out in a ditch somewhere in Eastern Europe, surrounded by corpses. And then, through the chaos, she heard American voices. Navy SEALs. The same unit that had left her position exposed an hour ago. The same men who had told her to stay back, that she was just a translator, that this wasn't her fight. Now they were her only chance at survival. If she could just stay alive long enough for them to find her among the dead. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. Ivy Harris had never planned to be anywhere near a combat zone. 3 months ago, she'd been finishing her linguistics degree at Cambridge, dreaming of working for the United Nations or perhaps teaching at a university. She spoke 7 languages fluently: Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Romanian, Serbian, English, and French, a talent inherited from her grandmother who'd survived World War II by being useful to whoever currently occupied her village. Languages keep you alive, her grandmother used to say, stirring tea in their small London flat. When you can speak to people in their own tongue, you become valuable. And valuable people survive. Ivy had taken those words to heart, though she'd never imagined they'd lead her to a NATO forward operating base in Romania, just 40 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. The position had seemed perfect when the recruiter contacted her, a civilian contractor role, translating intelligence reports, helping with local liaison, good pay, safe location, excellent experience for her resume. That had been 12 weeks ago, before the situation deteriorated, before the border skirmishes escalated, before the small Romanian base became a staging ground for special operations. Now Ivy found herself surrounded by soldiers who viewed her with a mixture of pity and annoyance, a 23-year-old academic playing dress-up in military fatigues that were 2 sizes too large. The Navy SEAL team arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. 6 men, all business, all hardened by experiences Ivy couldn't begin to imagine. Their team leader, a broad-shouldered Texan everyone called Reaper, had looked at her with barely concealed disgust during their first briefing. "You're the translator?" he'd asked, his tone suggesting she'd personally offended him by existing. "Yes, sir," Ivy had replied, though she knew he wasn't an officer and didn't technically require the honorific. "I speak, I don't care what you speak," Reaper interrupted. "What I care about is whether you can keep up and keep quiet when we're in the field. Can you do that?" Ivy had nodded, her face burning. Around the briefing table, the other SEALs exchanged glances. One of them, a lean man with a scar across his jaw who went by the call sign Wraith, actually smirked. "With all due respect, Reaper," Wraith said, "maybe we should request someone with more field experience. Someone who knows what they're getting into." "She's what we've got," Reaper replied curtly. "Command says she's the only one who speaks fluent Romanian and Russian. We'll make it work." Make it work. The phrase became Ivy's existence over the following weeks. She made it work when the SEALs conducted their pre-mission briefings at a pace that assumed she already knew military terminology she'd never encountered. She made it work when they woke her at 3 in the morning for emergency translations of intercepted communications. She made it work when they looked through her during mission planning sessions, as if her opinions on local geography and cultural considerations were less relevant than the wallpaper. The worst was Wraith. Where Reaper's disdain was blunt but professional, Wraith's was personal. He seemed to take pleasure in pointing out her inadequacies, in reminding her that she wasn't one of them. "Careful with that map, Doc," he'd said one afternoon, using the nickname they'd given her with obvious mockery. "Those coordinates are for people who actually know what they're doing. Wouldn't want you getting confused and sending us to the wrong village." Ivy had bitten her tongue, focusing on the translation work in front of her. She'd learned quickly that defending herself only made things worse. Better to stay quiet, do her job, and prove her value through competence rather than confrontation. But competence, she was learning, wasn't always enough. During mission briefings, when she tried to share intelligence about local militia movements gathered from her conversations with Romanian villagers, the SEALs listened politely and then ignored her completely. When she suggested alternative routes based on her knowledge of the terrain and local road conditions, Reaper would thank her and proceed with his original plan. "They don't trust you because you haven't bled with them," explained Lieutenant Kozlov, a Romanian liaison officer who'd taken pity on her. They were sharing coffee in the base mess hall, a grimy space that smelled of diesel fuel and instant noodles. Special forces operate on a different level. To them, you're just another civilian who'll panic when bullets start flying. "I'm not planning to panic," Ivy replied, though her voice lacked conviction. The truth was, she had no idea how she'd react under fire. Her grandmother had survived a war, but Ivy had never heard a gunshot outside of a movie theater. "None of us plan to panic," Kozlov said with a sad smile. "But combat has a way of revealing who we really are. The SEALs, they've already been revealed. They know what they're made of. You're still a question mark." The conversation haunted Ivy over the following days. A question mark. Was that really all she was? Her linguistics skills were exceptional, her analysis sharp, her work ethic beyond reproach. But in this world of hard men and harder choices, those qualities seemed to matter less than the ability to hump a 60-pound pack through hostile territory or maintain composure while being shot at. The mission briefing that would change everything came on a humid evening in late June. Storm clouds gathered over the mountains as the SEAL team assembled in the operations center, a converted warehouse that served as the base's nerve center. Ivy stood near the back, her notebook ready, though she'd learned that her notes were rarely consulted. "Intelligence indicates a high-value target meeting in this location," Reaper said, pointing to a village marked on the digital map. "Former Wagner Group commanders, now operating independently. They're coordinating with local separatist militias, planning operations against NATO supply lines." Ivy studied the map carefully. She knew that village, had interviewed refugees from the area just 2 days ago. They'd spoken of increased military presence, of checkpoints that appeared overnight, of civilians being forced from their homes. "The target building is here," Reaper continued, indicating a structure near the village center. "We'll insert by vehicle, approach on foot, conduct surveillance, and extract before dawn. Clean and simple." "What about civilian presence?" Ivy heard herself ask, surprising herself with her boldness. Reaper looked at her as if she'd suggested they bring flowers for the warlords. "What about it?" "The refugees I interviewed said the militia has been housing fighters in occupied civilian buildings. They use locals as human shields. If we're hitting a building in the village center, we're aware of the tactical situation," Doc, Wraith interrupted, his tone dripping with condescension. "That's why we're doing surveillance first. To identify threats and minimize collateral damage. It's kind of what we do." Several SEALs chuckled. Ivy felt her face flush but pressed on. "I understand that, but the refugees also mentioned that the militia sometimes stages false surrenders, uses civilians to lure in response teams." Thank you for the cultural briefing," Reaper cut her off. "We'll take that under advisement. Now, if there are no other concerns from the academic gallery, let's continue with the actual tactical planning." The dismissal was clear. Ivy fell silent, clutching her notebook like a shield. She'd tried to contribute, tried to share intelligence that might save lives, and been patronized for her trouble. Around the room, the SEALs returned to their planning, and Ivy became invisible once again. They left the base at midnight, 3 vehicles moving through the darkness without headlights. Ivy sat in the back of the second vehicle, wedged between equipment bags in uncomfortable silence. The SEALs communicated in hand signals and brief radio whispers, a language of efficiency she couldn't speak. The Romanian countryside rolled past, dark and ancient. Ivy pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching farmhouses and Orthodox churches slide by like ghosts. Somewhere out there, in villages like the one they were approaching, people were sleeping, unaware that armed men were moving through their world. 30 minutes into the journey, Reaper's voice crackled over the radio. "All units, hold position. We've got movement ahead." The vehicle stopped. Ivy felt her heart hammering as the SEALs readied their weapons with practiced efficiency. Through the windshield, she could see nothing but darkness and the vague shapes of trees against the slightly lighter sky. 2 vehicles, military configuration, reported one of the forward scouts. "Heading our direction." "Identify," Reaper commanded. Silence stretched. Ivy realized she was holding her breath. "Can't confirm. No markings visible. Could be local military, could be militia." "Harris." Reaper's voice came through the vehicle's internal comm. "Get up here. We might need your language skills." Ivy scrambled forward, squeezing between the seats to reach the front of the vehicle. Through night vision binoculars, she could see 2 trucks approaching slowly, their headlights casting long shadows across the road. "If they stop us, you do the talking," Reaper instructed. "Keep it simple. We're Romanian military, conducting routine patrol. Can you handle that?" "Yes," Ivy replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the adrenaline surging through her system. The approaching vehicle slowed, then stopped about 50 meters away. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then figures emerged, 7 or 8 men carrying weapons, flashlights sweeping across the road. "Here we go," muttered Wraith from the driver's seat. "Doc, try not to get us all killed with your pronunciation." Ivy ignored the jab, focused on the approaching men. As they drew closer, she could make out details: mismatched uniforms, weapons that looked well used, an air of barely controlled aggression that had nothing to do with professional military discipline. These weren't Romanian soldiers. "Militia," she whispered to Reaper. "Definitely militia. Can you bluff them?" "I can try." One of the men approached Reaper's window, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He shouted something in Romanian, aggressive and demanding. Ivy leaned forward, keeping her voice calm and authoritative as she responded. "We're conducting a security sweep. Orders from regional command. We need to pass through." The militiaman's eyes narrowed. He said something else, faster, laced with suspicion. Ivy caught words like identification and authorization, but there was something else in his tone, a certainty that troubled her. "He wants to see our papers," Ivy translated. "But I think he already knows we're not Romanian military." "How could he know that?" Wraith hissed. Before Ivy could answer, the militiaman stepped back and raised his weapon. In an instant, the road exploded with gunfire. The windshield spiderwebbed as bullets slammed into the vehicle's armored plating. Ivy felt strong hands yanking her down as Reaper threw the vehicle into reverse. "Contact! Contact!" voices shouted over the radio. "All units, we are compromised." What followed was chaos. The vehicles scattered, seeking defensive positions as more militia fighters appeared from the darkness. Ivy found herself pressed against the floor of the vehicle, her hands covering her head uselessly as the world dissolved into noise and violence. "They were waiting for us," Reaper shouted into his radio. This was a setup. Someone knew we were coming. The vehicle swerved wildly. Ivy felt it leave the road, bouncing over rough terrain. Through the broken windshield, she could see muzzle flashes in the darkness, hear the distinctive crack of incoming fire mixed with the deeper boom of the SEALs returning fire. "We need to find cover and regroup." That was one of the other team leaders, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Head for the tree line, 200 meters east." The vehicles lurched toward the cover of forest, bullets whining off their armor. Ivy's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. A setup. Someone had known they were coming. But how? The mission had been classified, discussed only within the operations center. Unless someone had talked. Unless someone at the base had leaked their plans to the militia. Unless. The thought died as their vehicle slammed into something, probably a fallen log or large rock. The impact threw Ivy against the seat in front of her, and she felt something crack in her ribs. Pain exploded through her chest, so sharp it drove the air from her lungs. "Everyone out! Move!" Move! Reaper was pulling her from the vehicle, half carrying her toward the tree line. Around them, the other SEALs provided covering fire, their discipline holding even in the chaos. They made it to the trees just as one of the other vehicles erupted in flames. Ivy watched in horror as figures scattered from the burning wreckage, some running, some falling, all of them consumed by the nightmare that had replaced their clean, simple mission. Count off! Reaper shouted. Sound off! The responses came quickly, call signs and confirmations. But Ivy noticed the gaps, the silences where voices should have been. They'd lost people in that initial ambush. We need to move, Wraith said, his earlier smugness replaced by grim professionalism. They'll be coming after us. Which direction? Someone asked. All eyes turned to Reaper, who was studying a handheld GPS device with increasing frustration. Signals being jammed. We're running blind. I know where we are. The words left Ivy's mouth before she could stop them. Everyone turned to look at her. I think I know. If we came off the road where I think we did, there's a ravine system about 1 kilometer north. It runs parallel to the border. We could use it for cover. You think you know? Wraith repeated incredulously. You think? I studied the maps, Ivy said, forcing herself to meet his gaze despite the pain in her ribs. Every day. I know this area. Reaper looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Lead the way, document. But if you're wrong. I'm not wrong, Ivy interrupted, surprised by her own certainty. They moved through the forest in tactical formation, with Ivy near the front, guiding them between trees and over rough ground. Behind them, she could hear shouts and crashing as the militia gave pursuit. The hunters had become the hunted. The ravine appeared exactly where Ivy had said it would, a deep cut in the earth that offered concealment and a route away from their pursuers. The SEALs slid down into it, weapons ready, eyes scanning the darkness. Nice call, Doc, one of them muttered as they moved deeper into the ravine. But there was no time for congratulations. The militia was close and getting closer. And somewhere in the darkness ahead lay uncertain terrain, unknown dangers, and a long night that was only beginning. The ravine wound through the earth like a scar, its walls rising 15 feet on either side. Ivy moved carefully, her injured ribs screaming with each breath, but she kept the pain hidden. Behind her, the SEALs followed in practiced silence, weapons trained on the darkness above. How much farther? Reaper whispered, his voice barely audible. Another half-kilometer, then the ravine splits, Ivy replied. We take the eastern fork. It leads toward the border, away from the villages. You sure about that? Yes. The certainty in her voice surprised even herself. But she'd studied these maps obsessively, memorizing every contour line, every geographical feature. What the SEALs had dismissed as academic overthinking had become their lifeline. Gunfire echoed above them, closer now. The militia was sweeping the area, their flashlight beams cutting through the trees like searchlights. Ivy pressed herself against the cold stone wall, feeling the dampness seep through her fatigues. They're hurting us, Wraith observed, his earlier mockery replaced by tactical assessment. Pushing us toward something. Toward what? Another SEAL asked. Ivy's mind raced through her memorized geography. If the militia knew this area as well as they seemed to, if they were indeed pushing the SEALs in a specific direction, then... There's a clearing, she said suddenly. About 2 kilometers ahead. If the ravine is being watched, they'd expect us to exit there. It's the only easy way out for the next 5 kilometers. Reaper studied her in the darkness. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we don't go to the clearing. There's another way. Harder, but unexpected. Show me. Ivy pulled out her small notebook, using a red-filtered flashlight to illuminate the rough map she'd drawn. Here. There's a side channel that branches off before the clearing. It's narrow, probably waist-deep in water this time of year, but it connects to a drainage system that runs under the main road. We'd come out behind their position. That's insane, Wraith said. We'd be trapped in a tunnel with no visibility, no room to maneuver. Better than walking into an ambush in that clearing, Ivy countered. The SEALs exchanged glances. In that moment, Ivy understood that her relationship with them had shifted. They were actually considering her plan, treating her input as valid tactical intelligence rather than academic theory. "We do it," Reaper decided. Harris leads. "Stay sharp, people." The side channel was everything Ivy had feared and nothing she'd prepared for. The water came up to their chests, icy cold despite the summer heat above ground. They moved in single file, weapons held above their heads, each step a careful calculation against slippery stones and uncertain depth. Ivy led, her teeth chattering, her injured ribs protesting every movement. Behind her, she could hear the SEALs' controlled breathing, could feel their trust in her judgment. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The drainage tunnel appeared exactly where her maps had indicated, a concrete mouth just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Ivy hesitated, staring into the absolute darkness beyond. "Problem?" Reaper asked. "No," Ivy lied, and crawled into the tunnel. The darkness was complete, suffocating. Ivy moved forward on hands and knees, the concrete rough against her palms, water flowing around her wrists. Behind her, she heard the SEALs following, their equipment scraping against the tunnel walls. Minutes stretched into eternity. Ivy's world narrowed to the feel of concrete beneath her hands, the sound of water, the pain in her ribs that had become a constant companion. She thought of her grandmother, surviving a war by being useful, by knowing things others didn't. "Languages keep you alive," grandmother had said. But so did geography, so did attention to detail, so did the stubborn refusal to be dismissed as irrelevant. Light appeared ahead, faint but real. Ivy crawled faster, ignoring the pain, focused on that distant promise of open air. The tunnel ended at a culvert covered by a rusted metal grate. "Can you move it?" Reaper whispered. Ivy pushed. The grate was heavy, corroded into place by years of neglect. She pushed harder, feeling something tear in her already injured ribs. The pain was blinding, but the grate shifted, just enough. "I've got it," Wraith said, squeezing past her in the narrow space. Together, they forced the grate aside. One by one, the SEALs emerged into the night. They were on the far side of the main road, exactly as Ivy had predicted. Behind them, across the road and beyond the ravine, they could see flashlights sweeping the clearing, searching for prey that had already escaped. "Outstanding work, Doc," Reaper said quietly. For the first time, the nickname didn't sound like an insult. They reached the abandoned farm compound just before dawn. The buildings were half collapsed, victims of some earlier conflict, but they offered shelter and concealment. Reaper established a defensive perimeter while Ivy collapsed against a crumbling wall, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the pain radiating from her ribs. "Let me see that," said one of the SEALs, a medic they called Ghost. He probed her side with professional efficiency, his touch clinical despite Ivy's sharp intakes of breath. "Cracked, maybe broken." "I can tape it, but you need proper medical attention." "We all need proper medical attention," Ivy replied, looking around at the battered team. They'd lost 2 men in the initial ambush, and the rest bore varying degrees of injury and exhaustion. Ghost taped her ribs in silence, then moved on to treat the others. Ivy watched the sun rise over the Romanian countryside, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink. Beautiful and indifferent to the violence unfolding beneath its light. "We need extraction," Wraith was saying into the satellite phone. "Current position is compromised. Militia presence is heavier than intelligence suggested. We need," he paused, listening. His expression darkened. "Say again?" "That's negative. We cannot hold this position for 6 hours. We need another pause." "Understood." "Out." He looked at Reaper. "They're not coming. Command says the situation is too hot. They need 6 hours to organize proper air support, coordinate with Romanian military, get diplomatic clearances in place." 6 hours, another SEAL repeated. "They'll find us in 2. Then we move," Reaper decided. We need a better position, something defensible until extraction arrives. All eyes turned to Ivy. She realized with a start that they were looking to her for guidance, expecting her knowledge of the terrain to save them again. There's a village, she said slowly, pulling out her worn notebook. About 3 kilometers southwest. It was evacuated 2 weeks ago when the militia activity increased. The refugees I interviewed came from there. If it's still empty. It could be a trap, Wraith interrupted. The militia would know we might head there. Everywhere could be a trap, Ivy countered. But this village has stone buildings, good sight lines, a church with a bell tower. We could hold it. Or die in it, Wraith said. We'll die here if we stay, Reaper stated flatly. Harris, how confident are you about this village? Ivy thought of the refugees she'd interviewed, their descriptions of their homes, their stories of fleeing in the night. She thought of the old woman who'd cried as she talked about leaving her garden, the church where she'd been married, the town square where her children had played. Confident enough, Ivy said. They moved out as the sun climbed higher, staying off roads, using tree lines for cover. Ivy led again, her navigation proving accurate at every turn. The SEALs no longer questioned her directions, no longer double-checked her assessments. She'd earned something more valuable than their respect, their trust. The village appeared deserted, exactly as the refugees had described. Stone houses lined narrow streets, their doors hanging open, windows dark. In the center stood the church, its bell tower rising above the surrounding buildings like a guardian or a tombstone. I don't like it, Wraith said. Too quiet. Everywhere's quiet when people have fled, Ivy replied. But she understood his concern. The village felt wrong, heavy with the weight of recent abandonment. They cleared buildings methodically, the SEALs' training evident in every movement. Ivy stayed close to Reaper, her role now understood, local knowledge, cultural context, linguistic support. Not a fighter, but not deadweight either. The church proved empty. They established defensive positions in the bell tower and the surrounding buildings, creating overlapping fields of fire. It was textbook tactics, exactly what their pursuers would expect them to do. For hours until extraction, Reaper announced, checking his watch. We hold here, we stay quiet, we wait. But waiting had never been the hard part. The hard part was what came after. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The militia arrived 90 minutes later, materializing from the countryside like ghosts. Ivy spotted them first from her position in the bell tower, counting figures moving between distant buildings, coordinating their approach with unsettling precision. Contact, she reported calmly into her radio. Multiple fighters, approaching from the north and east. They're flanking us. Numbers? Reaper asked. Ivy counted carefully. 20, maybe 25. Too many. Below, she heard the SEALs adjusting their positions, preparing for a fight they couldn't win. 6 men against 25, in a village that offered cover to attackers as much as defenders. The mathematics were brutal and simple. They're not attacking, Wraith observed over the radio. Just positioning themselves. He was right. The militia fighters were taking up positions in surrounding buildings, establishing their own defensive perimeter. Trapping the SEALs inside their trap. They're waiting for reinforcements, Reaper said. They'll overwhelm us with numbers. How long until extraction? Someone asked. 2.5 hours, Reaper replied. We need to buy time. Ivy watched the militia positions, her mind racing. There was something odd about their deployment, something that didn't match standard military tactics. They were clustered too heavily on the north side, leaving the southern approach relatively unguarded. It's another setup, she said suddenly. They want us to run south. Explain, Reaper commanded. Look at their positions. They're deliberately leaving an escape route. If we run, they'll have the advantage in open country. But if we stay and they reinforce, they'll have the advantage in numbers. Either way, we lose. So what do we do? Wraith asked. The question carried no mockery now, only genuine need for an answer. Ivy studied the village layout, thinking of the refugees' stories, the details they'd shared about their homes. We use what they don't expect. There's a drainage system under the village, old Soviet-era construction. The refugees mentioned it. Connects most of the major buildings. Another tunnel, someone groaned. Better than a bullet, Ivy replied. Can you find the access points? Reaper asked. I think so. The refugees said the main entrance was under the church, built as a shelter during the Cold War. They found it in the church basement, hidden beneath rotted wooden planks. A metal hatch, rusted but functional, opened onto a ladder descending into darkness. The space below smelled of mold and decay, but it was wide enough to move through, and according to the refugees' descriptions, it connected to several buildings throughout the village. We use it to reposition, Reaper decided. Hit them where they don't expect us, keep them off balance until extraction arrives. Harris, you map our route. Everyone else, stay sharp. They descended into the darkness, Ivy leading once again. The underground tunnels were a maze of concrete corridors and interconnected chambers, but she navigated by memory of the refugees' descriptions, by logic and educated guessing. They emerged in a building on the eastern edge of the village, behind the militia's position. Through shattered windows, they could see the fighters' backs, focused on the church they believed still held their targets. The SEALs did what they did best. Quick, silent, devastating. 3 militia fighters dropped before the others even realized they were under attack. By the time the alarm went up, the SEALs had vanished back underground, moving through the tunnels to a new position. They struck twice more, each time from an unexpected direction, each time melting away before the militia could respond effectively. The enemy's numerical advantage meant nothing when they couldn't pin down their targets, when every attack came from a new angle. But the militia adapted. They began moving more cautiously, watching all directions, pulling back from isolated positions. The game of cat and mouse was evolving, and the cats were learning. 1 hour until extraction, Reaper announced. We need to find a defensive position we can hold. They emerged from the tunnels in the southern part of the village, in a building that offered good sight lines and multiple exit routes. Ivy moved to a window, scanning for militia positions, and that's when she saw them. Civilians. A group of villagers, hands bound, being herded into the town square by militia fighters. The refugees hadn't all escaped. Some had stayed, or returned, or been captured trying to flee. They're using them as bait, Wraith said, appearing beside her. Trying to draw us out. Ivy's blood ran cold. Through her binoculars, she could see their faces, old men, women, teenagers. Terrified people who'd done nothing except have the misfortune of living in a war zone. We can't leave them, she said. We can't save them, Wraith replied. Not cruel, just stating tactical reality. We try to rescue them, we expose ourselves. We all die. So we just watch? We survive. That's the mission now. But Ivy couldn't look away from those faces, couldn't ignore the fact that she'd interviewed some of these people, had drunk tea in their homes, had promised them help was coming. There has to be a way, Ivy insisted, her eyes still fixed on the civilians in the square. An old woman knelt in the dirt, her hands bound behind her back. Ivy recognized her, Mrs. Popescu, who'd told her about fleeing her garden, about the flowers she'd planted 50 years ago with her late husband. There isn't, Reaper said, his voice carrying the weight of hard experience. Every instinct says help them. But that's what they're counting on. The second we move, we're exposed. They'll cut us down and then kill the hostages anyway. So we do nothing? We survive. We complete the extraction. We report their position so a proper rescue can be mounted. Reaper's logic was sound, military doctrine, the cold calculus of asymmetric warfare. But Ivy couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Popescu's stories, about the garden she'd tended for half a century, about the life she'd built in this village that had become a battlefield. She couldn't stop thinking about her grandmother's words, "Valuable people survive." What made someone valuable? What made a life worth saving? These questions had no military answers. "Movement," one of the SEALs reported. "They're bringing out more hostages. Looks like they're preparing for something." Through her binoculars, Ivy watched as more civilians were forced into the square. Among them, she spotted a face that stopped her breath: Teodor, the teenager who'd served as her translator during refugee interviews. A bright kid who dreamed of studying medicine, who'd been planning to evacuate with his family next week. "They're going to execute them," she said, her voice hollow. "To draw us out or prove a point. Either way, those people die." 45 minutes to extraction, Reaper said. "We hold position." But Ivy saw something else through the binoculars. The militia fighters were positioned around the square, their attention focused outward, watching for attacks from the surrounding buildings. They weren't watching the hostages themselves, confident that bound civilians posed no threat. "What if we don't attack?" Ivy said suddenly. "What? What if we don't go to them? What if we bring them to us?" She explained quickly, the tunnel system connected to a building adjacent to the square. If they could access it, could reach the hostages from below, they could bring them underground before the militia even knew what was happening. "That's insane," Wraith said. But his tone carried less certainty than his words. "It's the only way to save them without a direct assault," Ivy argued. "The tunnels give us concealment. We grab who we can, pull them down, seal the entrance before they react. And if they catch us in the act?" Reaper asked. "We'd be trapped underground with civilians, no room to fight, no way out." "Then we're trapped underground," Ivy said. "But at least we tried." The silence stretched. Through the window, the sound of shouting drifted from the square. The militia was preparing for something, their movements becoming more purposeful. "I'll go alone," Ivy said. "I speak Romanian. I can explain quickly, keep them calm. You maintain the defensive position, cover the extraction. If it works, we save them. If it doesn't, you're still in position to complete your mission." "Absolutely not," Reaper said. "You're not trained for hostage rescue." "You're not, I'm not a SEAL," Ivy finished. "I know. But I'm the only one who can talk to them without confusion, who knows the tunnel layout, who they might actually trust when a stranger appears from underground." She could see Reaper calculating odds, weighing variables. The mission was extraction and survival. Saving civilians wasn't part of the equation. But sometimes, she realized, the mission wasn't everything. 10 minutes, Reaper finally said. "You get 10 minutes. If you're not back by then, we complete extraction without you." "Understood. Wraith goes with you." "And Harris?" Reaper met her eyes. "Don't be a hero. Heroes get killed. Be smart instead." They descended into the tunnels again, moving quickly through passages Ivy was beginning to know by heart. Wraith followed close, his weapon ready, his earlier disdain replaced by grim professionalism. "For the record," he said as they moved, "this is still insane." "I know," Ivy replied. "But it's brave insane. There's a difference." They reached the building adjacent to the square and found the access point exactly where Ivy had predicted, a cellar door, weathered but functional. Above them, separated by just a few feet of stone and earth, the hostages waited. "I'm going up first," Ivy said. "I'll bring them down. You guide them through the tunnel system back to the others. What if there are guards? Then you'll hear gunshots, and you'll know it didn't work." Before Wraith could argue, Ivy pushed open the cellar door and climbed into the building above. Sunlight streamed through broken windows. Through a doorway, she could see the square, could see the hostages just 20 feet away. No guards inside. The militia's attention was focused outward, watching for an attack that wouldn't come. Ivy moved to the doorway, caught Mrs. Popescu's eye, and pressed a finger to her lips. The old woman's eyes widened. Ivy gestured urgently, "Come here, quietly, now." Mrs. Popescu understood. She began shuffling sideways, bound hands making movement awkward but possible. Behind her, other hostages noticed, began moving as well. Slowly, quietly, they crept toward Ivy while their captors watched the wrong direction. Theodore reached her first. Ivy cut his bindings with Wraith's knife, whispered urgent instructions in Romanian. He nodded, understanding, and began helping others toward the cellar entrance. It was working. 5 hostages free, then 8, then 12. They moved like shadows, silent and desperate, disappearing underground while the militia remained focused on threats that didn't exist. Then a child stumbled. The sound was small, barely audible, but in the tense silence of the square it rang like a gunshot. A militia fighter turned, saw the movement, saw the cellar door, saw Ivy standing in the doorway. He raised his weapon and fired. The bullet hit Ivy between her shoulder blades with the force of a sledgehammer. She felt herself falling forward, the world tilting sideways, the ground rushing up to meet her face. There was no pain at first, just shock, just the sudden understanding that everything had changed in the space of a heartbeat. She hit the dirt hard, her already injured ribs screaming in protest. Around her, chaos erupted. The militia fighters opened fire on the building, bullets chewing through wood and stone. She could hear Wraith returning fire from the cellar, could hear the hostages screaming in Romanian, could hear her own ragged breathing growing weaker. Doc's hit. Doc's down. Wraith's voice over the radio, urgent and angry. We need covering fire, now. Through fading vision, Ivy saw Theodore and Mrs. Popescu being pulled underground by other hostages, disappearing into the safety of the tunnels. Good. They'd made it. That's what mattered. More gunfire. The militia was advancing on her position, shouting orders to each other. Ivy tried to move, tried to crawl toward the cellar entrance, but her body wouldn't respond. Her legs felt distant, disconnected, as if they belonged to someone else. Hold on, Harris. That was Reaper's voice, but it sounded far away. We're coming for you. No, Ivy wanted to say. Complete the mission. Get the hostages out. Don't risk yourselves for me. But her mouth wouldn't form the words, wouldn't cooperate with her desperate need to tell them to leave her behind. Bodies fell around her. 2 militia fighters went down as the SEALs provided suppressing fire. Another stumbled, clutching his leg. The square was becoming a killing ground, and Ivy was trapped in the center of it. Then hands grabbed her, strong hands that lifted her like she weighed nothing. Through the haze of shock, she recognized Wraith's voice close to her ear. I've got you, documents stay with me. He was carrying her, running toward the cellar entrance while bullets snapped through the air around them. Ivy felt herself being passed to other hands, felt the sensation of descending into darkness, felt the cool dampness of the underground tunnels replacing the hot sunlight of the square. How bad? Reaper's voice, tense and controlled. Bad. That was Ghost, the medic. Entry wound between the shoulder blades. Exit wound, looks like it deflected off bone. She's losing blood fast. Ivy felt pressure on her back, felt Ghost working quickly to stop the bleeding. The pain was arriving now, waves of agony that made her previous cracked ribs feel like a minor inconvenience. She tried to speak, to ask about the hostages, but only managed a weak groan. The civilians are secure, Reaper said, as if reading her mind. Theodore's leading them through the tunnels to the extraction point. You did it, document. You saved them. But at what cost? Ivy could feel her strength draining away with each heartbeat, could feel the cold creeping into her limbs. She'd saved the hostages, but she might have sacrificed herself to do it. Stay with us, Harris, Ghost urged, his hands working to stabilize her. Don't you quit on us now. Not after everything. Ivy wanted to stay. Wanted to see this mission through, wanted to know if they all made it out safely. But the darkness at the edges of her vision was growing, spreading like spilled ink across paper. Extraction ETA? Reaper demanded. 12 minutes, someone replied. Can she last that long? She has to, Reaper said fiercely. We didn't come this far to lose her now. They were moving through the tunnels, carrying her carefully but quickly. Ivy caught fragmented impressions, the sound of water dripping, the smell of mold and earth, voices speaking in urgent tones. The SEALs had abandoned their defensive position, had committed everything to getting her and the hostages out. They'd broken protocol for her. These hard men who followed orders without question, who calculated odds and made tactical decisions based on cold logic, had chosen to risk everything for one injured translator. Why? Ivy managed to whisper, the word costing her enormous effort. Why what? Ghost asked, not pausing in his treatment. Why risk the mission, for me? Reaper's face appeared above her, his expression intense. Because you're one of us now, document. And we don't leave our people behind. The words wrapped around Ivy like a blanket, warming the cold that had been spreading through her body. One of us. She'd spent months trying to earn that status, trying to prove she belonged. And now, bleeding in a tunnel beneath a hostile village, she finally understood that belonging wasn't about physical strength or combat skills. It was about being willing to sacrifice for others. It was about doing the right thing even when it was dangerous, even when it defied logic, even when it might cost you everything. Helicopter inbound, crackled the radio. Landing zone secure. Bring them home. They emerged from the tunnels into the fading daylight, the hostages running toward waiting vehicles while the SEALs formed a protective perimeter. Ivy heard the beautiful sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the air, saw the aircraft descending toward them like salvation. Ghost had her on a stretcher now, for a line already inserted, pressure bandages holding her together. You're going to make it, he told her firmly. You hear me, Harris? You're going to make it. Ivy wanted to believe him. But as they loaded her into the helicopter, as the aircraft lifted away from the chaos below, she felt consciousness slipping away like sand through her fingers. Her last thought before the darkness claimed her was of Mrs. Popescu's garden, of flowers that would bloom again, of life that persisted despite war and violence and impossible odds. Consciousness returned in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror slowly reassembling. Ivy was aware of voices first, speaking in rapid Romanian, tense and frightened. Then pain, sharp and insistent, radiating from her back through her entire body. Then the smell, earth, decay, and something metallic that she recognized as blood. She tried to open her eyes but couldn't. Tried to move but found her body unresponsive. Panic fluttered in her chest, but training, the discipline she'd learned from months with the SEALs, pushed it down. Assess the situation first. Panic later if necessary. She was lying on her stomach, face pressed against cold ground. Her hands were beneath her, and when she tried to move her fingers, they responded sluggishly. Good. Not paralyzed. Just weak, possibly in shock, definitely injured. The voices continued above her. Militia fighters, she realized, speaking about body counts and tactical positions. One of them was standing close, so close she could hear his boots shifting in the dirt just inches from her head. How many did we get? A voice asked in Romanian. 12 confirmed kills. Maybe more in the tunnels. The SEALs retreated, took their wounded with them. What about the hostages? Gone. Most of them escaped underground. The commander is furious. Ivy processed this through the fog of pain and confusion. The SEALs had escaped with most of the hostages. The mission had succeeded. But these fighters thought she was dead, counted her among the 12 bodies they'd found. She needed to keep them thinking that. Moving even slightly might draw attention, might result in a confirmation shot to ensure she was really dead. So she lay perfectly still, controlling her breathing to shallow movements that could be mistaken for nothing, and listened. Orders are to leave the bodies, another fighter said. We're pulling back to regroup. NATO will probably send recovery teams for them. What about identification? The commander wanted to know if we got anyone important. We'll photograph them before we leave. Quick pictures, then we move. Ivy's heart hammered against her ribs. Photographs meant they'd be examining the bodies more closely, rolling them over, checking faces. If they moved her, they'd realize she was still breathing, still bleeding fresh blood instead of the older blood that covered her from other bodies piled around her. Footsteps approached. Someone knelt beside her, close enough that she could feel their breath on her neck. A hand touched her shoulder, preparing to roll her over. This was it. The moment where her survival would be determined by her ability to play dead convincingly enough to fool someone trained to confirm kills. Ivy let her body go completely limp, stopped fighting the pain, stopped trying to control anything. She became weight, nothing more, a body among bodies. The fighter rolled her partway over, enough to see her face. Ivy kept her eyes half open but unfocused, staring at nothing, her jaw slack. Blood from her back wound had pooled beneath her, creating a convincing scene of fatal injury. "This one's the translator," the fighter said. "The woman who was helping them. Get the picture and let's move. This place gives me a bad feeling." A camera phone clicked several times. Then Ivy felt herself being rolled back to her original position, face down in the dirt. The fighter stood, walked away, his boots crunching on gravel. "All teams, we're pulling back," a voice commanded over a radio. "Leave the bodies for NATO cleanup. We need to reposition before they send reinforcements." Ivy listened to the sounds of retreat, vehicles starting, equipment being loaded, voices fading into the distance. She counted slowly in her head, forcing herself to remain motionless even as every instinct screamed at her to check her injuries, to seek help, to move. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The sounds of the militia fighters faded completely, replaced by the natural sounds of early evening, wind through the ruined buildings, distant birds, the rustling of leaves. Carefully, infinitely slowly, Ivy opened her eyes fully. She was in a pile of bodies, other victims of the firefight, positioned near the cellar entrance where she'd fallen. The militia had collected the dead in one location, probably to make photographs easier, and she'd been counted among them. She tried to move and nearly screamed from the pain. The bullet wound in her back was serious, possibly life-threatening without medical attention. But she was alive, which meant she had a chance. Ivy began the agonizing process of extracting herself from the pile of bodies, each movement a fresh wave of agony. Her medical training, basic as it was, told her she needed to stop the bleeding, find shelter, and signal for help. But first, she needed to move, needed to get away from this death pile before anyone came back. It took 20 minutes to crawl 10 feet. Her arms shook with effort, her back screamed protest, and several times she nearly passed out from the pain. But she kept moving, inch by inch, pulling herself across the dirt toward the relative safety of a collapsed building. She'd almost reached it when she heard the sound, helicopter rotors in the distance, growing closer. NATO rescue? Or militia reinforcements? Ivy didn't have the strength to determine which, didn't have the energy to signal even if it was friendly. She collapsed in the shadow of the ruined building, her strength finally exhausted. Through fading consciousness, she saw the helicopter pass overhead, saw it circle the village once, twice. Then it moved on, disappearing toward the horizon. They hadn't seen her. She was alone, injured, with night approaching and no guarantee anyone would return before she bled out or went into shock. This was how it ended, she realized. Not in a heroic firefight, but slowly, quietly, among the ruins of a village that had seen too much death already. But Ivy Harris had never been good at accepting endings. She'd fought for every opportunity, every chance to prove herself, every moment of respect she'd earned. She wasn't going to stop fighting now. She pulled herself deeper into the ruined building, found a relatively sheltered corner, and used the last of her strength to pack her wound with cloth torn from her own clothing. It wasn't much, but it might buy her a few more hours. Then she allowed herself to rest, conserving energy, focusing on survival. The SEALs would come back. They had to. Reaper had said they don't leave their people behind. She just had to stay alive long enough for them to find her. Night fell over the ruined village like a shroud. Ivy drifted in and out of consciousness, her world reduced to pain, cold, and the stubborn refusal to die. Time became meaningless, measured only by the shifting shadows and the gradual cooling of the air. In her lucid moments, she thought about her grandmother's stories of survival. The old woman had hidden in a barn for 3 days during World War II, wounded and alone, waiting for liberators who might never come. You survive by wanting to, she'd told young Ivy. By deciding that death is not acceptable, no matter how logical it seems. Ivy held onto those words like a lifeline. Death was not acceptable. Not here, not now, not after everything. The sound of helicopters returned around midnight. This time, they landed in the village square, their searchlights cutting through the darkness like beacons. Ivy tried to call out, but her voice was too weak, swallowed by the sound of rotor wash and tactical commands. Through the gaps in the ruined wall, she watched shadowy figures moving through the village. American voices, speaking in the efficient shorthand of military professionals. A recovery team, she realized. They'd come back for the bodies. She had to signal them somehow. Had to let them know she was alive. Ivy searched her pockets with trembling fingers and found her emergency flare, standard issue for all personnel on forward operations. She'd never imagined actually needing it. Her hands shook as she tried to activate it. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. The mechanism was jammed or damaged from her fall. Ivy wanted to cry, wanted to rage at the unfairness of surviving this long only to be overlooked by rescuers just meters away. Then she remembered, her radio. If it still worked, if it hadn't been destroyed by the bullet or her fall, she might be able to transmit. She pulled it from her vest with agonizing slowness, praying it wasn't broken. The power light flickered weakly when she turned it on. Damaged, but functional. Ivy pressed the transmit button, gathered what little strength she had left, and whispered, "Reaper, this is Harris. Still alive. Northeast quadrant. Ruined building." She released the button and listened. Nothing. Had they heard her? Was anyone even monitoring that frequency? Say again? The voice crackled through the speaker, filled with disbelief. "Harris, is that you?" Confirmed, Ivy managed. "Shot but stable. Need extraction. Holy, everyone, cease operations. We have a survivor. Harris is alive. Repeat, Harris is alive." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Searchlights swept the northeast quadrant, voices called her name, and then suddenly Wraith was there, appearing in the doorway of her shelter like an angel of death turned savior. "Doc," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. "You absolute crazy, impossible, wonderful pain in the ass. We thought you were dead." "Surprise," Ivy whispered. "Ghost. Get over here now." Wraith was checking her pulse, examining her wound, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the emotion in his voice. "How the hell are you still breathing?" "Grandmother taught me, stubbornness." Ghost appeared with a medical kit, his professional calm barely concealing his shock. "Impossible," he muttered as he worked. 18 hours with this wound, exposure, shock, blood loss. You should be dead 10 times over. Kept disappointing expectations, all my life, Ivy managed. Why stop now? They stabilized her quickly, professional training overriding their emotional reactions. For lines, pressure bandages, warming blankets, all applied with the efficiency that separated special operations medics from regular medical personnel. Reaper arrived as they were preparing to move her. He stood in the doorway, his weathered face showing more emotion than Ivy had seen in all their months together. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her as if confirming with his own eyes that she was really alive. "Gave us quite a scare, Doc," he finally said, his voice rough. "Sorry, sir." "Don't be sorry. Be proud. You did something today that I've never seen in 20 years of service." He knelt beside her stretcher. "You saved 23 civilians, survived being shot in the back, played dead convincingly enough to fool trained fighters, and then held on long enough to call for help. That's not just survival, Harris. That's warrior spirit. Just didn't want to die with work unfinished," Ivy said. "The hostages?" Reaper answered the unspoken question. "All safe. Every single one. Teodor led them through the tunnels like he'd been doing it his whole life. Mrs. Popescu wouldn't leave the extraction point until we confirmed your status. She's been praying for you since we arrived. Tears leaked from Ivy's eyes. She'd done it. Completed the mission. Saved the people who needed saving. And somehow, impossibly, survived the experience. They carried her to the helicopter on a stretcher, the entire recovery team forming an honor guard around her. As they lifted into the night sky, Ivy caught a last glimpse of the village below, the place where she'd died and been reborn, where she'd proven that courage had nothing to do with size or strength. "Hey Doc," Wraith said, securing her stretcher in the helicopter. "For the record? That thing you did, getting shot and still completing the mission? That's going in the books. They're going to be telling stories about you for years." "Good stories?" Ivy asked weakly. "The best kind. The true ones." The first week was a haze of surgery, medications, and enforced rest. Ivy floated through it, her body healing while her mind processed everything that had happened. The doctors called her survival miraculous, a combination of luck, physiology, and sheer determination that they couldn't fully explain. "The bullet should have killed you," one surgeon told her during a follow-up examination. "It hit your scapula at an angle that deflected it away from your spine and major blood vessels. 1 degree different, and you'd be paralyzed or dead. Someone was watching over you." Or maybe, Ivy thought, her grandmother's stubborn genes were just stronger than bullets. The SEALs visited daily, individually and as a group, bringing news from the outside world and stories that made her laugh despite the pain. The hostages were safe, resettled, already starting to rebuild their lives. Teodor had been accepted into a medical program in Bucharest, his heroism during the rescue earning him scholarships in recognition. Mrs. Popescu had returned to her village, determined to replant her garden even if the war still raged around her. "She asked me to give you this," Ghost said one afternoon, handing Ivy a small cloth bag. Inside were flower seeds, carefully collected and preserved. "She said her grandmother gave them to her during the last war, and now she's giving them to you. Something about warriors needing to plant gardens." Ivy held the seeds carefully, understanding the symbolism. Survival wasn't just about fighting. It was about building, planting, believing in a future worth fighting for. On the 8th day, Reaper arrived with an unusual expression, something between pride and discomfort. "You've got visitors," he said. "Official ones." 2 generals and a Romanian minister entered her room, their dress uniforms a stark contrast to the casual military attire Ivy had grown accustomed to. They spoke about valor, about international cooperation, about the importance of her actions in strengthening NATO-Romanian relations. Then they presented her with medals, a silver star from the American military, a Romanian decoration for bravery, and letters of commendation from both governments. Ivy accepted them with appropriate humility, though part of her wondered what her academic advisors at Cambridge would think of their linguistics student receiving military honors. After the officials left, Wraith lingered in the doorway. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. Why did you do it? Go after those hostages when you knew it could get you killed?" He genuinely wanted to understand. "You're a civilian contractor. You could have stayed safe, let us handle the tactical stuff. Nobody would have blamed you." Ivy thought about the question carefully. "Remember when you first met me? You called me Doc like it was an insult. Like being educated made me useless in the real world. I was an ass. You were a SEAL doing what SEALs do, prioritizing mission effectiveness over feelings." Ivy shifted carefully in her bed. "But here's what I learned, education isn't the opposite of action. Caring isn't the opposite of strength. I went after those hostages because I'd talked to them, interviewed them, promised them help was coming. I couldn't be the person who broke that promise. Even if keeping it killed you? Especially if keeping it killed me. Because what's the point of survival if we lose our humanity in the process?" Wraith was quiet for a long moment. "You changed us, you know. The whole team. We're supposed to be hard, focused, emotionally detached. But watching you fight for those civilians, watching you take a bullet and keep going, it reminded us why we do this job. It's not just about completing missions. It's about protecting people. You always knew that. Maybe. But we'd forgotten. You reminded us. He stood to leave, then paused. The team voted. Unanimously. We want you permanently assigned to our unit. If you're interested. As what? The translator who gets shot. As our cultural liaison, linguistics specialist, and apparently our conscience. He smiled. Plus, someone needs to keep us from being complete assholes to the next person who doesn't fit our preconceptions. After he left, Ivy stared at the ceiling, processing the offer. 2 months ago, she'd been an overlooked translator, dismissed and underestimated. Now she was being invited to join one of the most elite units in the military, not despite her differences but because of them. Her grandmother would have appreciated the irony. The sun was setting when Ivy's eyes finally opened. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why everything hurt. Then it came flooding back, the gunshot, the fall, the bodies, the silence. She tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain exploded through her back, her ribs, her entire body. But she was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was alive. Don't move. The voice came from nearby, gentle but firm. Ivy turned her head slowly and saw Ghost, the SEAL medic, sitting beside her makeshift bed. They were in some kind of shelter, stone walls, low ceiling, the sound of generators humming. Where? Ivy managed to croak. NATO Field Hospital. Romanian side of the border. You've been unconscious for 18 hours. Ghost checked her foreline, his movements practiced and efficient. You should be dead. The bullet hit your shoulder blade, deflected along the bone, exited near your spine without hitting anything vital. 1 inch different, and we'd be having a very different conversation. Ivy processed this slowly. The hostages? Safe. All of them. Theodore kept them calm underground while we extracted. Kid's got nerves of steel, just like someone else I know. The SEALs? Everyone made it out. Close call, but we're all breathing. Ghost paused, then added quietly, because of you. That stunt you pulled, saving those civilians while buying us time to prepare for extraction, it changed the tactical situation completely. The militia got confused, pulled back to regroup. By the time they realized what happened, the helicopters were already inbound. Ivy closed her eyes, relief washing over her. They'd made it. All of them. There's something else you should know, Ghost continued. When you got shot, when you fell into that pile of bodies, Reaper went crazy. I've served with that man for 8 years, never seen him lose his cool. But when you went down, he completely disregarded orders, charged into that square under heavy fire to get to you. He did? Wraith too. And Thompson, and Martinez. The whole team. They carried you and the remaining hostages through those tunnels while taking fire from 3 directions. Ghost's expression was serious. SEALs don't break formation for civilians. We're taught to maintain mission focus, complete objectives, make hard choices. But you changed something in them. In all of us. The door opened and Reaper entered, followed by Wraith and the rest of the team. They looked exhausted, battered, but alive. More importantly, they looked at Ivy differently than they had 2 weeks ago. Doc, Reaper said, and this time the nickname sounded like a combination. You scared the hell out of us. Sorry, Ivy replied, managing a weak smile. Don't be. You saved 23 civilians and proved something I didn't think needed proving. He pulled up a chair, sat down heavily. I've been in special operations for 15 years. Seen every kind of courage there is. Physical courage, tactical courage, moral courage. But what you did in that village, that was something different. Stupidity? Ivy suggested. Humanity, Wraith corrected. He stood near the door, arms crossed, but his expression held none of its former mockery. You saw people who needed help, and you helped them. Didn't calculate odds, didn't weigh mission parameters, didn't ask permission. You just did what needed to be done. That's not how military operations work, Ivy said. No, Reaper agreed. It's not. But maybe sometimes it should be. You reminded us why we do this job. It's not just about completing missions or following orders. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. Ghost spoke up. The Romanian government is calling you a hero. They want to give you a medal. The civilian hostages have been asking about you non-stop. Mrs. Popescu knitted you a blanket. He pointed to a colorful Afghan draped over a nearby chair. Tears pricked Ivy's eyes. She thought of the old woman's garden, of Theodore's dreams of medical school, of all those lives that might have ended in that square. There's more, Reaper said. Command has asked if you'd consider a permanent position with Special Operations Liaison. They want someone who understands both the tactical and human elements of what we do. Someone who can bridge the gap between military necessity and civilian reality. Ivy looked at the faces around her, these men who'd dismissed her, then trusted her, then risked their lives for her. What did you tell them? That it's your decision. But for what it's worth. Reaper leaned forward. You've earned your place at the table, document. Not because you got shot, but because you proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is care when everyone else says caring is a liability. SEALs have a reputation, Wraith added. We're supposed to be hard, emotionless, focused only on the mission. And we are those things when we need to be. But you showed us we can be something else too. We can be human. Ivy thought about her grandmother's words, about survival and value and what it meant to be useful in a war. She thought it meant speaking languages, knowing geography, providing tactical intelligence. But maybe it meant something more. Maybe it meant remembering that behind every tactical decision, there were human lives worth saving. I'll think about it, she finally said. Take your time, Reaper replied. But not too much time. We've got another mission in 3 weeks, and I'd really like someone who knows what they're doing to handle the local liaison work. They left shortly after, letting Ivy rest. But before Reaper exited, he turned back. One more thing, Harris. What you did, rising from those bodies after being shot, leading those hostages to safety while bleeding, that's going into the after-action report. Future operators will study it. You've become part of SEAL history. As what? Ivy asked. The crazy translator who didn't know when to quit. Reaper smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. As proof that courage comes in all sizes, that the heart matters as much as the muscle, and that sometimes the most important mission is the one that doesn't appear in any tactical manual. 3 months later, Ivy stood in the same briefing room where she'd once been dismissed as irrelevant. But everything had changed. The NATO liaison patch on her shoulder identified her new role, and when she spoke, entire rooms fell silent to listen. The refugee situation in Sector 7 has deteriorated, she told the assembled officers and operators. We have approximately 200 civilians trapped between militia positions and the border. They're running out of food, medicine, and hope. What's the tactical assessment? Asked the colonel Ivy didn't recognize. Tactically, it's a nightmare. The terrain favors the militia, extraction points are limited, and any overt military action risks civilian casualties. Ivy pulled up a detailed map. But there's another way. She explained her plan, a coordinated effort using local Romanian military for visible presence while special operations teams move through underground routes to evacuate civilians in small groups. It would take days, require perfect coordination, and depend on the kind of cultural knowledge and linguistic skills that couldn't be taught in any tactical course. It's ambitious, the colonel admitted. Who would lead the ground element? I would, Ivy said simply. Around the room, the SEAL team she'd come to know well nodded their approval. Reaper, Wraith, Ghost, they'd become more than colleagues. They'd become friends, brothers in arms, people who understood that strength took many forms. The mission launched 2 days later. It went exactly as Ivy had planned, which meant it was complicated, exhausting, and required constant adaptation. But over 4 days and nights, they evacuated 193 civilians through underground passages, drainage systems, and forgotten Cold War tunnels. Mrs. Popescu was among them, clutching her knitting needles and a small bag of flower seeds from her abandoned garden. Teodor helped translate, his dreams of medical school now funded by a scholarship from a grateful Romanian government. Families were reunited, lives were saved, and Ivy proved once again that the most important victories weren't always the ones that made headlines. On the final night, as the last helicopter lifted off carrying the final group of refugees, Ivy stood with Reaper watching the sun rise over the mountains. "You know what the crazy part is?" Reaper said. "6 months ago, I thought you were a liability. Thought caring about civilians made you weak, that emotion was the enemy of good tactics. And now?" Ivy asked. "Now I know that caring is what makes us worth following. Tactics win battles, document. But humanity wins wars." He glanced at her. "You taught us that. Taught me that. I didn't teach you anything. I just refused to accept that we had to choose between completing missions and being decent human beings. That's exactly what you taught us." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the new day emerge. Ivy thought about her journey from overlooked translator to respected liaison, from academic to operator, from dismissed to essential. But the real change wasn't in her title or her role. It was in how she saw herself, and how others saw her. She'd proven that you didn't need to be the biggest, strongest, or most heavily armed to make a difference. Sometimes you just needed to be brave enough to care when others said caring was foolish. Sometimes you needed to see people as people, not tactical considerations. Sometimes you needed to remember that behind every mission objective, there were human lives that mattered. "There's another operation coming up," Reaper said, breaking the silence. "Deep penetration, high risk, lots of moving parts. Command wants someone who can navigate the cultural complexities, someone the team trusts completely." He looked at her. "They want you." Ivy smiled. "When do we leave?" 48 hours. That enough time? For what? To decide if this is really what you want. This life, these risks, this constant dance between duty and humanity. Ivy thought of her grandmother, surviving a war by being valuable, by speaking languages, by understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply be useful to those who needed you. She thought of Mrs. Popescu's garden, of Teodor's dreams, of all the lives that hung in the balance every time difficult decisions needed to be made. "I decided 3 months ago," Ivy said. "When I woke up after being shot and realized I'd do it all again. Every risk, every danger, every impossible choice. Because some things are worth bleeding for." "Like what?" "Like proving that soldiers can have hearts. Like showing that caring isn't weakness. Like remembering that we're not just completing missions, we're protecting people." She met his eyes. "Like being the kind of person my grandmother would be proud of." Reaper extended his hand. "Welcome to the team, document. For real this time." Ivy shook it firmly. Around them, the Romanian countryside stretched peaceful and beautiful in the morning light. Somewhere out there, refugees were rebuilding lives, families were staying together, and children were dreaming of futures that almost didn't exist. And in a briefing room that would soon be full of maps and mission plans, a small translator who'd been shot in the back and rose from a pile of corpses had proven something more important than any tactical victory, that the human heart, when combined with courage and competence, was the most powerful weapon of all. The helicopters returned to base. The mission ended. But Ivy's journey, the one that had started with dismissal and evolved into respect, continued forward. Because some missions never really end. They just transform into the next challenge, the next opportunity to prove that impossible isn't permanent and that caring isn't weakness. It's strength. The kind that changes teams, saves lives, and reminds everyone that behind the tactics and training, we're all just people trying to do the right thing in a complicated world. And sometimes, that's exactly enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.